Like to start off talking about your book from 2017, Democracy. You describe populism, nativism, isolationism, and protectionism as what you call the four horsemen of the apocalypse. 3 years later, in 2020, how do you feel democracies are faring with those four horsemen?
Well, it's certainly, I think, not a good story in terms of how we're faring with what I've called the four horsemen of the apocalypse. In fact, uh, it appears, and very often crises do this, that the COVID-19 crisis, if anything, has tended to reinforce, maybe even exacerbate some of the trends toward isolationism. You know, it's very interesting. What you've gotten is a response where the sovereign state is king in response to the pandemic. So it's my citizens, my borders, my PPE. The international organizations seem to have almost been sidelined during this period of time. That underlying trend toward nativism, take care of my own, seems to be stronger than at any other time in my memory. And by the way, it's quite in contrast to the way that the response to September 11th, or the response even to the financial crisis of 2008, where there was very much a sense that these were contagions that couldn't be really contained within borders. And so I think we're going to have a lot of hard work to do to rebuild some sense of international cooperation as one of the important elements to respond into crisis once we are through this terrible situation. And let me just finally say, I understand that impulse, but it's still one that I'm sorry to see.
Thank you. Maybe to drill down a little bit on the topic of populism, if you take a more homogenous country, say like Hungary, their populism is more a sense of Hungary versus the world, Hungary versus outsiders. Here in the United States, populism seems to focus less on that and more on our internal divisions, on red versus blue, on race, on religion, on native born versus immigrant. Um, how do we best deal with those tensions in our own country that have been brought up by populism?
Well, you're very right that the response of a country that's homogenous is around kind of old-fashioned nationalism, my nation against others. The United States, of course, is this odd creation in that what it is to be American is not tied in some way to nationality or to religion or to ethnicity. We come from, and our ancestors came from every corner of the world. And so you couldn't have a response that says, okay, what is it to be American in the way that you see it in a Hungary? But what we are having an uncomfortable conversation about is then how do we define American? And what I see happening to us is that we divide ourselves into ever smaller groups, each with its own narrative, each with its own grievance, each with its own history. And it becomes about whether my grievance or my narrative is superior to yours in some way. And what has been sacrificed is the kind of sense of a common narrative that was not based somehow on our tribe, our ethnicity, our nationality. That was a common narrative that was based on a belief that you could come from humble circumstances and you could do great things. And that was actually a narrative that was without regard to what your race or ethnicity or nationality was, even though we know that in reality, there were barriers to that dream if you were of a certain color. I grew up in segregated Birmingham, Alabama. To say that the American dream was fully accessible to the people with whom I grew up, not true. But even so, we kept working toward that common narrative, toward that common idea. As Martin Luther King put it, the content of your character, not the content of not the color of your skin. And so that's somehow what we've lost, is that sense of a common narrative.
When we think about divisions, it's become increasingly clear that some of our adversaries, Russia in particular, are seeking to exploit the divisions that we have. We know that they've invested a lot of time and effort and money in things like social media disinformation and so forth, not just in the United States, but particularly here in the United States. How can a free society like ours best respond to a country like Russia that is attempting to manipulate factions and divisions within our own society?
Well, the first thing, it goes without saying that we have to actually help to heal the divisions within our society, because if they weren't there, you wouldn't have anything to try to stimulate. And obviously, this is something that the Russians and others, the Chinese and others, have tried to do: take disaffected populations and make them even more disaffected. This is, by the way, an old playbook. It goes back to Joseph Stalin's time, when he talked about the building of fifth columns within societies, which were disaffected populations that would rally to the side of the Communist International rather than to their own false consciousness of nationhood with the United States or other places. But they would never have dreamed what a gift social media would be in that regard, because social media is so much more efficient at identifying referent groups that are disaffected, playing to their disaffection, because social media allows you to be within your own echo chamber, where you might only engage people who are like you, people who think like you. Then this ability to really rile disaffected populations becomes much more efficient. So I think we have several things to do. First of all, my view of this with the Russians is, first time, shame on them; second time, shame on us. We know what they did, we know how they did it. There ought to be complete cooperation between social media platforms and the government to make sure that they don't do it again. Secondly, some of it's actually pretty ham-handed and pretty silly. I've looked at some of these. Um, People ought to be smart enough to see that these are really concocted from foreign powers. You can, some of them, you look at them, you think that's not an American. Right? So calling that out is really important. And then the final thing that we need to do is that we all need to get out of our little social media echo chambers and bastions. I've been saying to people, you know, if you're constantly in the company of people who say amen to everything you say, find other company. I'm going to date myself, but when I was a kid, my family watched the Huntley Brinkley Report every night. Some people watched Walter Cronkite. Some people watched Howard K. Smith. If you were a generation later, you watched Brokaw and Jennings and Rather. Well, now that kind of common basis, where we all saw basically the same moonshot, the same civil rights movement, the same Vietnam War, has given way to I can go to my website, my bloggers, my aggregators, my cable news channel. And you know what happens when you don't encounter people who think differently? You think they're either stupid or they're venal. And that's also happening to us. So some of this is the responsibility of individual citizens to stop falling into this trap of, I'm only going to listen to people who look like me, think like me, and believe like me.
I'll ask you one more question and hand it over to my colleagues if that's okay. Talking again about populism, um, to what extent have, when elites in politics or the media or business or education or other fields are distant from common people, from ordinary people, and not understanding kind of the anxieties that the average citizen is feeling, how does that uh, threaten our politics or threaten our culture when we have these sort of out of touch elites, assuming you agree with the premise?
I do agree with the premise. So, look, populism is not actually anti-democratic. It can lead to anti-democratic tendencies, but what it is anti-institutional. And so it says those institutions, those elites, uh, they don't believe in you. They don't have your interest at heart. They only have their interest at heart. You see social and economic inequality growing between elites and common people. That adds to that notion of elites who are distant. You hear sometimes the way elites talk about, quote, common people. For me, one of the really interesting interesting outcomes was after the Trump election. The number of my academic colleagues and journalists and others who almost in an anthropological way were going to go look at those people and what they thought. And there's a reason that hillbilly elegy was so popular. It was because, oh, that's what those people think. And unfortunately, a lot of the common experiences that we used to have, whether it was military service or church going or the like, we don't have those to the degree anymore. And elites have separated themselves further. The other big contributor, and I think it's well understood, I believe in globalization. I think it was beneficial to us to have a kind of integrationist narrative about the world. But we seem to have forgotten that those of us who moved easily around the world, who spoke different languages, who benefited from globalization, uh, most people never moved more than 25 miles from where they were born. Telling the unemployed coal miner in West Virginia, well, globalization was good for you because you can buy cheap goods at Walmart. It wasn't selling. And in fact, we forgot that while globalization had tremendous macro benefits, and indeed benefits for this global elite of which we're all a part, it actually left a lot of people behind. And they are desperate and they feel disrespected. And it's not surprising then that a populist can come along and say, those people never had your interest at heart, and they believe it.
Actually, I'm glad you brought up this notion of globalization and kind of how some people feel left behind. And I'm wondering, given whether it's feeling left behind or a sense of a loss of national identity or cultural identity, uh, how should democracies respond to this challenge to address the needs of those who are in need around the world, but also make sure that others don't feel left behind within the country itself?
Yeah. Well, the answer is different, I think, for the United States than for some other democracies. The problem is different for different places. I think Europe has a real problem because they actually did try, because of their own history, to push nationalism aside, to push national identity aside, and to subsume it in a European identity. And it was sort of represented by the idea that Brussels, the unelected bureaucrats in Brussels, were making decisions about everything from what Italy's budget deficit could be to what constitutes cheese. That's a different problem where the attempt to shove national identity aside actually backfired, and people said, no, I want to be Polish, I want to be English. Brexit was a result of that. I think Europe is going to have a very hard time repairing any sense of a European identity, particularly because COVID-19 has even more exposed those fissures. But in the United States, when you look at what has happened, I do think, as I said earlier, this lack of a common narrative has been problematic. But so too has our inability to talk across our cultural and ethnic lines in a way that recognizes that a lot of people are suffering. A lot of people are finding that they don't have access to high quality education for their kids. You know, this again, I know I keep returning to the crisis, but it's on everybody's mind. This has really exposed inequalities in ways that I'm not sure we even understood how much they existed. So just think about those of us who are on these meetings, these Zoom meetings. We can be efficient, we can be productive, we can keep doing our work. Um, there's some 40–50% of us for whom this hasn't been at all disruptive to what we do. But if you have to go to the shop floor or you have to go work in a restaurant, you're unemployed. If you're a small business owner, you're unemployed. And so this has exacerbated and exposed economic inequality in very important ways. And oh, by the way, talk about education. If you're a kid trying to learn at home under these circumstances, right? I was homeschooled for my first year of school because in Alabama, you had to turn 6 by October 31st to go to school that year. I was born November 14th. My parents were educators. There was no way I was going to miss first grade for a whole year. So my mother, who was a teacher, took the year off and taught me at home. She knew how to do that. What about the kid who's trying to learn at home with parents who don't even speak the English language at this point? So I think that these inequalities and the sense of being left behind is very deep, and we have to address that first and foremost. And then we do have to address this kind of cultural divide where we don't know each other very well anymore, where we live in very separate societies if you are well off and if you're not. And I've been a big proponent even of national service as a way to give us more common experiences. I have a lot of students of mine, who've gone to teach for America, and they get a really very different look at America when they go into the Mississippi Delta to teach. I think we need more of those experiences.
Thank you, Dr. Rice. I'll let Bill conclude in a moment, but if I may ask just a quick follow-up question, and maybe you covered it a bit at the end there, but given that globalization has benefits, but people, as you noted rightly, are concerned about their national identity, is there a way to sell people on combining these two forces to show the mutual benefit for everybody?
Well, America has always believed that we are better off when the world is better off. We've never defined our self-interest as just, or at least not in the last 70 years, as just being about us. And I believe that gene is still very much alive, that DNA is still very much alive in Americans. You see it when there is a natural disaster someplace and there's a great outpouring from Americans, often through faith-based institutions. You see it when they say, ISIS will not behead people on television. We are going to have to respond to that. Americans, I understand, are tired. They're really tired of the big responsibilities of leadership, but they also don't like what happens when America doesn't lead. They don't like when Vladimir Putin annexes Crimea. They don't like when the Chinese beat up people in the streets of Hong Kong. And so this is about leadership, and I think an American president can appeal to that other impulse which says we're better off when others are better off. And if you look at something like AIDS relief, when under President Bush and continuing under President Obama and now under President Trump, we took on this pandemic of AIDS that was ravaging an entire continent. And through our leadership, a lot of people are alive today who wouldn't have been. Americans are proud of that. We've just got to give them more examples of why we matter in that way.
Thank you.
If I can close with a couple of questions, I'd like to circle back a little bit of what you're talking about tribalism at the beginning. If you could comment on what role you think identity plays in some of the democratic unrest we're seeing, not just here in the U.S., but around the world. What role do you think identity plays?
I think identity is a fine thing. To know who you are, know where you came from, know your history, know the struggles of your people. I'm very, very proud of my African-American background. I have to say, American slavery is such that I have 40% European DNA, which says something about the way slavery was carried out. So identity is a complex thing, particularly in a country like this. But identity in itself is not a problem. The problem is when you weaponize your identity against someone else. My identity entitles me to things that you don't have. My identity means that you have to step back because I have suffered more. It's the weaponization of identity that is really an issue. The other thing about identity is that if it just becomes about ethnic or racial or religious identity, that in a sense can be somewhat dangerous. I've said very often to people who promote diversity, diversity is really, really important. We need people from different backgrounds. But we ought to realize sometimes that there's more in common in a diverse group than we would normally expect. So if you go to one of I live in Silicon Valley, you go out to one of the tech companies and you look, and it's getting to be a pretty diverse group of people. But you know what? They all went to the same schools, and they all went to the same colleges, and they all have the same technical skills. I begin to think if we could just start to find in our diversity commonality, if we recognize that people have multiple identities, not just identities linked to color of their skin or identities linked to their economic circumstances, they have multiple identities, then we will realize what really is the genius of America, which is that we aren't of one ethnicity, one nationality, one religion. We are this incredible hodgepodge. I won't call it melting pot. That's a word that people don't like anymore because it suggests that you have to just kind of conform. No, in fact, a lot of the energy comes from all of us. And somebody mentioned earlier immigrants. Let me just say that to the degree that we forget that we are a country of immigrants, to the degree that we forget that the real appeal of America's great creed, it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going, is that that's allowed us to attract people from the most advanced countries in the world to lead the knowledge-based revolution, like Sergey Brin, whose parents brought him here from Russia. He would never have founded Google in Russia. To the person who comes here to make $5, not 50 cents. And they're equally energetic and they're equally vital in revitalizing us and keeping us young and keeping us hungry and keeping us working for that dream. And so identity is a terrific thing, but not if it becomes a prison. And to a degree, identity is becoming something of a prison rather than something of an asset.
Thank you. Well, let me wrap this up. This last one, you were talking about some of the inequalities that have been exposed through the pandemic. Here, thinking more globally. So what impact do you think the coronavirus, the pandemic, is going to have on democratic stability around the world going forward until we get a vaccine, treatments, whatever? And how might democracies best remain stable so they don't give in to the four horsemen?
Yes. Well, the first thing is to guard against overreach of government into the lives of people. We've all been willing to stay home and to do all of the things that we needed to do to try to keep each other safe. But at some point, government needs to let go a little bit, you know, and people have to have a sense of control of their lives again. One of the things that America has going for it that's worked very well for us, I would say, in this circumstance is federalism. People inherently trust government that is closer to them than government that is further away. And so to the degree that localities and states are able to now move at their own speed, that's going to help us get around a sense of centralization and too much government. I think democracies are going to have to go back to first principles about things like how do they give opportunity to as many people as possible, knowing now what we know about the divisions and the inequalities that we faced. But I also hope democracy is going to realize that you can't spend forever. You know, the amount that we've rolled up in national debt is ultimately going to come back to haunt us. And so there's going to have to be a reckoning for some of the decisions that we've taken rightly under crisis to get back to something that is more stable and sustainable. And the final thing is, I think democracies like the United States, Great Britain, will be fine. I worry about the unconsolidated democracies, the younger democracies, where the temptation for continued authoritarianism might be even pushed further in places like Hungary. I worry about Poland. I worry about the effect on countries in Africa, for instance, or in Latin America that have only recently begun to have democratic governments, especially in Africa, where we've only finally gotten away from presidents for life. Now, I was told a very interesting and heartening story by Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia, who of course rescued her country from civil war. And we were the United States, a big part of that. But she talked about how in Africa, the work that we did goes back to why America matters. The work that we did with AIDS relief and malaria relief and helping them to build better healthcare systems, which was one of the real benefits of the way PEPFAR was carried out, has actually helped them to manage these crises. They know how to talk to their tribal chiefs. They know how to get out to the villages. And we help to build those systems. So I hope they will continue to be robust under the strains and stresses. But it's going to take leadership to say, we're going to do this we're going to provide security and health in a democratic way. And that means that people have to have a voice.